Welcome aboard. In the video today, we are looking at Magnus Carlsen crushing Hikaru Nakamura from the 2024 Norway Chess event. This game here illustrates why Magnus Carlsen is considered an endgame magician, the best endgame player of all time. Let's jump straight in. The game opened with e4, Magnus with the white pieces. We have a symmetrical response with e5, the knights get developed, and the bishop gets placed on its most active square on b5. a6 is played, kicking the bishop to a4, and then black responds by developing their bishop to c5. We have white castling, and here the knight comes to a little bit of an awkward square on e7. More natural was the move knight f6. On e7, though, Hikaru Nakamura is trying to reroute the knight to g6. The knight there is a pretty good defensive piece for the king. Okay, the game continues with knight takes e5. This was the tactical possibility that black did not address by moving the knight to e7. Now, what's the idea? Well, after knight takes e5, d4, striking in the center, winning back the piece with interest because you are expanding, you are gaining space, you are gaining initiative, and already Magnus Carlsen is in a pretty good scenario. Now, black attacks the bishop with b5, but that's okay. The bishop simply sneaks away to b3, and the situation is very much the same. One of these pieces on c5 or e5 will be lost. Hikaru Nakamura decides to part ways with the bishop, taking the pawn on d4. Queen takes d4. d6 here is played to solidify and keep safe the knight on e5. And here, c3 is played. A bit of a weird move. You are taking away that square from the knight. The knight can no longer develop actively, but there's a couple of points. Mainly, you are giving the c2 square for the bishop, which will become relevant very soon, and it's usually relevant in these structures where black often expands using the pawn on d6 as a launching pad to expand further with c5 and then c4, where you're gonna wish that this bishop had a way to escape down to c2. So c3 is played, bishop f4, and indeed we see this move c5, like I was saying, using the pawn on d6 to launch, but there's a key downside and weakness that you are creating, which is that very pawn on d6. As you will see in a couple dozen moves, this pawn becomes a very strong weakness, and arguably it ends up being the reason that Hikaru loses the game. Let's keep going. So queen comes all the way retreating back to d1. We have bishop developing to b7, putting pressure on the pawn on e4, so rook to e1 defends that pawn, keeping it safe, and now queen to c7, getting the queen off of the back rank, connecting the rooks, looking to soon use the rooks on some of these files here, and these are obviously the files where something's gonna happen, right? Either white is gonna end up pushing and opening them, or black is gonna try to push and open them themselves. Magnus continues by playing bishop c2, voluntarily moving the bishop out of harm's way. It's true that c4 wasn't played yet, but you'll see that it is played very soon because black can hardly, in these positions, keep the pawns on c5. The idea of gaining the space is to keep pushing it forward, and namely, you want to carve out some squares for your pieces. So now the d3 square is always something that black has to watch out for. And further, these pawns can also continue pushing down the board, using the pawn on c4 as the beginning of a pawn storm. But this d3 square is the important one that I want to kind of keep you thinking about, because very soon black ends up playing knight d3. Now they are giving away a pawn. I hope you notice that bishop takes d3 and then rook takes d3 loses a pawn, but the idea for Hikaru Nakamura is you're gonna win back the pawn on e4. Now when the dust clears after all of these trades, let's take stock of the position, and I think queen d1, this latest move, really helps us do this. Why? Because queen d1 points out the glaring weakness in black's position. Look at the pawn on d6. It is forever weak and vulnerable, and all of white's pieces are putting pressure on this pawn. So, ladies and gentlemen, this endgame, objectively it's holdable, but practically it's becoming very uncomfortable for Hikaru Nakamura to navigate, and in the current moment, he has to really make a strong decision. What do you do about this pawn? Now, there are two approaches. Approach number one is to play the best move, which is d5. You're going to keep this pawn defended. Now the bishop defends it along with the rook, and it's true that the knight can come and attack it, but black is just in time to play knight to e7, excuse me, and defend the pawn on d5. So this is what black should have done, but it's understandable why they didn't, because in this final position, white is having all of the fun. Look at this, the rook, the queen, and the knight are pressuring a weakness. Meanwhile, we have 3 pieces dedicating their lives to defend one simple pawn. Further, the bishop is really strong, cutting along the dark squares, and additionally, the pawn on d5 is really blocking in the bishop on b7. So you can see that positionally, this is not a move that you want to make, which is why Hikaru Nakamura, instead of playing d5, decides, let's give away that pawn. Let's play h6, allow Magnus Carlsen to take the pawn on d6. But ladies and gentlemen, it is not a good idea to allow the best player in the world to go up a pawn, especially in an endgame, which again, Magnus Carlsen is known as the best endgame player. So let's see how Magnus Carlsen slowly but surely ends up converting this up pawn position. Because objectively, okay, you're up a pawn, but there's no clear weaknesses that you can attack. Your knight is also a little bit funny, and so it's not clear how Magnus Carlsen will make immediate progress. Let's see what he does. Number 1, he activates the knight. The knight that I was just talking about, it was passive on f1. Let's bring it into the game on e3. And very soon, he brings the queen to the centralized square on d4. So he is improving his pieces. And after queen to c6, okay, there is sort of pressure here, and the knight no longer is able to move, because if the knight moves away trying to put some pressure, oh no, you have just blundered mate. So instead, f3 is played to restrict the pressure that the bishop and queen pose on the g2 square. And after queen to e6, b3 is played to do the same, restrict the pressure that the queen poses on the a2 square this time. So Magnus Carlsen is being calm and patient, making sure to clog any holes that he has in his position, keep everything defended, and then he will make progress with his superior pieces and extra pawn. So knight to d7 is played here, but this allows the check with queen to d3. And here, black probably should have moved the king, for example, to g8, but then you have to contend with a couple of things. First of all, of course, this check, it's not very clear that you want to allow it. In this particular case, there's nothing better than actually repeating after giving the check. So giving the check, the king comes to h7, then bringing the queen back to d3. There isn't really much else that white can do, but there's a more specific thing. Instead of giving the check, c4 becomes very much possible because of the improved placement of these pieces. And really, white needs to use their extra pawn, right? If you have an extra pawn, but it's just sitting on the first rank, it's meaningless. You want to start pushing it, right? So c4, trying to create a passed pawn, and after something like this pawn would become quite strong. So instead of allowing c4, black plays queen to g6. Now, Hikaru Nakamura poses a serious question. Do you trade the queens? Now, Magnus Carlsen very quickly and very confidently says yes. Now, what is the ideal? Well, in this sort of endgame, and this is where the instructional value of this game comes into play, ladies and gentlemen, in this sort of endgame, the position often will hinge on the activity of the king, because both players have a knight and they have opposite colored bishops. And therefore, if this king can get active, let's say on b6, then it will be able to cause some serious damage using its extra pieces to create some pressure, hopefully winning 1 or 2 other pawns and then promoting the extra material. That is the question. Can the king, that certainly right now does not look too impressive, can it get active? And if that's the question that this position, this endgame hinges on, then why would Magnus trade? Because on first glance, it seems that the answer is no. This king is more active than its counterpart, and so it seems like this king will be able, based on its current location, to come closer into the center of the game, restricting the white king from activating, and black maybe could even try to put some pressure. But guys, that is purely an illusion, because the pieces here are totally restricting the king. Look at this. The king cannot come to this square here. The knight is attacking it. The king can try to come to f6 and then come to this square here, but the bishop's holding that one. The king can try to come to e6 and then come to d5, but the knight is holding that. The king can't even come to this square here on d6 and then try to come to c5 because the bishop controls that square. The point is that these two pieces here are completely restricting and boxing this king on the 6th rank. This king is not able to put more pressure, come closer down the board, and therefore it was a strong decision to trade because these two pieces are not able to do the same to this king on g1. This king on g1 has a very specific and unopposed path towards the b6 square. Okay, let's keep going. So, king to f2, we have a knight trade offered, And in this position, you can take the knight, and that is winning, and Magnus Carlsen could have gone for this, but then this king is able now to come to f5, right? Because the knight is no longer controlling it, or the king could end up coming to d5. So instead, Magnus Carlsen brings the knight to d1. Now you might be wondering, wait a minute, can't the king come anyways now to f5 or d5? Well, yes, in theory, but c4 is always on the horizon, and the second this knight moves, the knight can jump right back into action on e3 and then hit wherever the king ends up landing. So long story short, Black is still unable to make any progress with the king. They try to play f6 and then wrap the king around to f7 and then bring it to e6. But again, the king for white is simply much stronger than the opponent's king on e6. Look at this piece here. It is not allowing this king to come cross the line to d6. And to be clear, guys, if the king could come to d6, it would actually grab opposition and really stop this white king from making any progress, but it can't. And for that reason, Magnus is better. For that reason, he traded into the endgame when he traded the queens, and he's able to convert this. So let's take a look at what he does. He brings the king to c5. He could have simply brought the king further to b6. I'm not sure why he didn't do this. He decides first, let's get the knight into the action, and then bring the king to b6 very shortly. Now, this is a really interesting position, because as white, you can take the pawn, and this is the tempting move. But then f5 comes, and white is still better, but now they have to really contend with the idea of playing f4 and forking these pieces, and further, these pawns are simply beginning to roll down the board. So instead of taking the pawn on a6, bishop to e1 was played, preemptively stopping the power of f5 because f4 no longer comes with a fork. And moreover, the idea now is to reroute the bishop to c3, and once the bishop is on c3, largely because of the fact that all of these pieces have been concentrated on the queen side defending against the king that has just come to b6, Black is really unable to defend the queen side. So this maneuver with bishop e1 to c3 has allowed white to start attacking on a second front, and that is a super important detail because now these pawns begin to fall. So first f5 falls, then the bishop comes and takes some of these other pawns. The position begins to collapse. Finally, you can take the pawn on a6 safely without allowing any shenanigans with f5 and f4 on the king side, and the position is completely winning after king to b6. Hikaru Nakamura resigned because there's already very shortly ideas of pushing this pawn and beginning to promote it. This pawn is also weak. The second this knight gets into a slightly more active square, so for example f5, it will begin to contribute to the attack as well. And frankly, down 3 pawns against Magnus Carlsen, I think it's fair to resign. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. Subscribe if you are new around here, like the video if you learned something new from it, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace out.